A young janitor criticized an old man for the mess, not realizing it was his boss. When the truth came out, the consequences were far worse than he could ever imagine. What happened next shocked even the most seasoned individuals. But let's start from the very beginning. Chris was a young, ambitious janitor, newly hired at a small hotel on the outskirts of town. He was eager to make a good impression on his colleagues and superiors, hoping this job would be his first step toward a successful career. The hotel was quiet and calm, with affordable prices and simple rooms, often frequented by business travelers or elderly guests seeking peace and quiet. This morning, Chris was assigned to clean the room of an elderly black man named Gregory. He knew the guest was quite old, but that didn't concern him much. Chris often encountered guests like him, who he thought didn't care much about the cleanliness or tidiness of their rooms. He was used to elderly people not always maintaining order. When Chris entered the room, the first thing he noticed was the mess. The table was cluttered with papers, an empty water bottle lay on the nightstand, and an old bag with one zipper undone was lying on the chair. Everything seemed to Chris to fall short of his cleanliness standards. He frowned and muttered under his breath, "Here we go again with the old folks. How can they let things get this bad?" Gregory, sitting on the bed, didn't pay attention to the janitor. His face was calm and his gaze focused as he quietly flipped through his newspaper. The state of the room and the small messes Chris had noticed didn't seem to bother him. Gregory knew these things could happen and didn't even try to change anything. He was old and his habits were deeply ingrained. Chris, irritated, continued cleaning. He was convinced that elderly people were incapable of maintaining order and discipline in their surroundings, and probably didn't care to do so. All the wrinkled sheets and scattered items, these to him were signs that a person had lost their sense of organization. "How can anyone live like this?" he thought, carefully wiping the floor and setting a coffee cup on a tray. Gregory didn't respond. He sat quietly reading, as though nothing was happening around him. Chris dusted the shelf and continued, not realizing that the person sitting before him wasn't just an old man, but the owner of the hotel. But he failed to see this in his internal judgment. His eyes were blind to the truth. The next morning, Gregory went down to the hotel restaurant for breakfast. He was neatly dressed in a simple, elegant coat and jeans, but his appearance didn't attract much attention. Gregory preferred to avoid the spotlight and didn't like when people focused on his age or appearance. He kept his emotions in check and was a rather quiet person, which gave him the freedom to avoid unnecessary conversations. Chris was walking by when he noticed the old man at the table. Gregory was carefully lifting his coffee cup, but as before, he left a small coffee stain on the table. Chris felt irritated, watching him act so carelessly. How could this person not even notice how he's making a mess everywhere? Why can't he just be more careful? Unable to hold himself back, Chris approached the table, not thinking about who was sitting there. His words were sharp. "Are you always this untidy? Why don't you ask someone to clean up after you? Don't you care about what you leave behind?" Gregory raised his eyes and looked at Chris over his glasses. His gaze was calm, but there was something about it that made Chris feel uncomfortable. Gregory didn't respond, only returning to his coffee without reacting to the accusations. Chris felt his irritation building. "What strange old people! Always acting like this," he thought. His words grew harsher, but Gregory still didn't react. Chris turned and walked away, feeling that the silence was another victory for the old man. But then, the waiter who was serving breakfast intervened. He approached Chris in a quiet but firm voice. "Do you know who this is?" he asked. Chris shook his head, sensing a strange unease in the air. "It's Gregory," the waiter continued. "He's the owner of this hotel. He's not just a guest." Chris froze. He felt his face pale. Everything he had just said to this man suddenly took on a completely different meaning. His words now seemed not just harsh, but an unforgivable mistake. He stood there, bewildered, looking at Gregory, who seemed to notice neither him nor the situation. His reaction was nothing more than indifference. The next day, Gregory came to the hotel office. Chris, still reeling from what had happened, sat at his desk, trying to focus on his work. His mind was consumed by just one thought. How could he have been so foolish to judge someone without knowing who they really were? Gregory entered the office with his usual confident steps. He wasn't in a hurry or trying to draw attention, but when he approached Chris, the young janitor realized that this moment would not be simple. "Do you remember me?" Gregory asked, his voice calm, without any hint of accusation. Chris slowly looked up, trying to figure out what to do. "Yes, I remember," Chris barely managed to say, trying to comprehend the significance of this conversation. Gregory took off his glasses and placed them on the desk. "I'm the owner of this hotel, and you just humiliated me without knowing who I really am." Chris felt his face burn with shame. He didn't know what to say. He wanted to justify himself, but couldn't find the words. Gregory continued. "You judged me for being old and for not maintaining order. But you forgot one thing. You didn't know who I was. You allowed yourself to judge without knowledge. This isn't just a mistake. It's the result of how society teaches us to look at others." These words seemed to strike Chris to the core. He began to realize how deeply ingrained his stereotypical view of people was, which had made it so easy for him to judge. He felt shame, which overshadowed all other feelings. Gregory turned and calmly said, "You're not to blame. You've become part of a system that teaches us to think this way, but it can be changed. All you need to do is acknowledge your mistakes and learn from them." Chris didn't know how to respond. He sat in complete silence, stunned by the revelation he had just received. Several days passed before Chris gathered the strength to apologize. He now understood that apologies couldn't turn back time, but he had to try to correct his mistake. He found Gregory in the hotel lobby. Gregory was sitting in a chair, lost in thought, as always, calm and serene. "Gregory, I was wrong," Chris began, feeling his heart beat faster. "I insulted you, and I didn't know who you really were. I'm so ashamed of what I said." Gregory looked at him with a soft smile. "You made a mistake, but that's not a big deal. The most important thing is to understand that it wasn't just a random incident. You've become part of a system that makes people think they can judge others by appearance or status. But now you have the chance to change that." "I didn't know you were the owner," Chris said, lowering his head. "And it's hard to accept that I was so cruel and arrogant." Gregory nodded. "You've become part of a system that makes us look at each other with bias, but you can step out of this circle if you want to." Chris felt something change within him. He knew this wasn't just a conversation. It was a lesson he had to learn. He decided that he would never judge anyone by their appearance or status again. He understood that true respect comes with recognizing your mistakes and being willing to change. From that day on, Chris respected every person, regardless of their age, skin color, or social status. And though Gregory continued to live his peaceful life, he knew that there was now someone in his hotel who understood the importance of respect and acknowledging everyone who walked through its doors.